Okay, Quasi, you got some? You got my time? Yep. Okay. Okay. So today's lecture is on externalities. So I'll talk briefly about negative externalities and positive externalities. Okay. So we'll define externalities as an externality is a third-party cost. So that in any transaction, there's a buyer and a seller. Okay. We assume that when I buy something, I'm willing to pay exactly what I expect to receive in terms of utility and value, right? So the amount of money I'll pay should be equal to what I receive in terms of value, okay? And then the business is willing to sell the good for, or the good or service for whatever it is they think that good's worth, and whatever it costs them to produce that good. Okay, so they get their value, and I get my value, and all the costs and all the benefits of that transaction are internal. Okay, internal meaning there's two parties, and all the costs and all the benefits are captured by those two parties. They're internal to the transaction. Okay, if that's the case, then there are no externalities. However, sometimes when there's a transaction, there are third parties that are either helped or hurt. Either they they reap some of the benefits, or they bear some of the costs, even though they weren't a part of the transaction. Those are called third parties. Okay, and when that happens, when third parties either bear costs or reap benefits, we have what's called an externality. There's a cost or benefit that's external to the transaction. Okay, so that's the vocabulary around a lot of that. Okay, so we'll talk about two kinds of goods, or goods which result in negative externalities, and goods when they are bought and sold and produced result in positive externalities. Okay, so we'll start with negative externalities. Okay, so we have here in blue, the blue curves represent what we've already studied in this course, the supply and the demand of, in this case, aluminum. Okay, the supply curve represents the marginal cost of producing aluminum for businesses, right? So the extra cost related to the production of one more unit of output. Okay, the demand curve represents the extra value that is derived from consumption of one more unit of the good. So this is essentially the marginal cost, and this is essentially the marginal benefit of one more unit of aluminum. Okay? All right, so you would say that this is the marginal private cost. That's what MPC stands for. The supply curve represents the cost that businesses incur and that they use to calculate their production. Okay, when they go to make a decision about how much aluminum to produce, these are the costs that are represented by this curve are the costs that they're using to make that calculation about how much output to produce. Okay, so we call that the marginal private cost of producing the good. It's what the business pays to its land, labor, and capital, and its opportunity cost. The opportunity cost to the entrepreneur, right? Okay. Now, on the demand curve, this blue demand curve represents the private benefits of consuming the good. When I, as a consumer, make a decision about whether or not to buy the good, the amount of value I get from consuming it is represented on this, or at least I perceive, okay, is represented on this blue curve, and we would say that's the marginal private benefit, okay? Now, with aluminum, when aluminum is produced, right, it's produced in factories that end up polluting, okay, emitting pollution that is bad for the environment and eventually can be bad for the health of people who live in areas around those factories and so forth and so on. Okay, so when aluminum is produced and sold, it will be sold to that quantity. Okay, so that would be the market quantity. okay, at the intersection of private demand and private supply, or private benefits and private costs. Okay, and with consumers making their decisions based on what they see as the value to them, and businesses making their decisions based on what they see as the costs to them. But what the businesses don't take into account is that when they produce the aluminum, they do have to pay their land, labor, capital, right? They have to pay their land some rent, they have to pay their capital some interest, and they have to pay their workers a wage. But they don't account for the fact that when they produce the aluminum, it produces pollution, which causes people to get sick and go to the hospital, which is a cost to society, right? So part of the cost of producing aluminum is borne by third parties. Those third parties have to pay that cost. The business doesn't, right? The business doesn't pay that cost, and so when it makes its decision about how much to produce, it doesn't consider the cost, all the health costs of producing aluminum. And therefore, it produces more than is optimal. Okay? So you want to think about it this way. What's going on here? Okay? That the cost of producing a unit of aluminum is actually a little bit greater than the business perceives it to be. Okay? So say for 1 unit of aluminum here, or say a ton of aluminum, the business sees the cost of production as being, somewhere up here, like $1, okay? It's probably a little bit more than that, right? That's why I'm a teacher and not an aluminum producer. Right? In any case, right? When the business produces that aluminum, okay, it produces pollution, which then causes somebody to get sick, and that 1 unit, that 1 ton of aluminum might cause $1 worth of hospital bills for somebody else, somebody who neither bought nor produced the aluminum, a third party. Okay, that $1 is an externality. Okay, it's the social cost or the extra social cost of producing the good. So the actual social cost of producing the good is $2, right? The $1 worth of resources, which are used to produce aluminum, and thereby can't be used to produce something else, right? So there's an opportunity cost, right? That's a social cost. But then in addition to that, there are health costs of $1. And so the total social cost is $2, but the business only recognizes $1. They only bear $1 of that cost, and therefore they only consider $1 of that cost. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and so if you were to do this for each unit of output, if for each unit of output the social cost was $1 greater than the private cost, okay, then you would essentially have two curves. A private cost curve here, and a social cost curve, a marginal social cost curve, which is parallel to the marginal private cost, and the horizontal difference between the two being exactly equal at $1 for each unit of output. Okay? And so then we would say that the socially optimal amount of output, okay, where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost, is going to be here at Q optimum. That would be the socially optimum amount of output, or the allocatively efficient amount of output. Sorry. Okay. So with this, when the market is left to its own devices, okay, when the government doesn't interfere, when there's no interference in the market, what we find here is that the market fails. Okay? The market fails to produce the socially optimal amount of output, which is contrary to everything we've learned to this point. Okay? Everything we've learned to this point tells us that markets, when allowed to operate without government interference, will allocate resources to their most efficient uses. Okay? But now we find here that markets can fail. Okay? When there's an externality present, in this case a negative externality where some third party is hurt by production of the aluminum, okay? Too much aluminum is produced. Okay, some of those resources, the resources which are used to produce the output between here and here, should be used for some other kind of production. Okay, so that's a misallocation of resources, and it creates this deadweight loss, DWL, right, deadweight loss. So typically on the test, you might do something like this. Okay, to represent the deadweight loss. Okay, now, so when there's so with market failure, okay, so now we're introducing the idea that markets aren't always perfectly efficient. If they're not always efficient, this introduces the potential for government action. Okay, so when markets fail, that is reason, at least according to some economists, for governments to enter the market, interfere in the market, intervene in the market process in order to correct the misallocation of resources. Okay, and so what the government would want to do is find a way to shift that supply curve to the left so that the marginal private cost is equal to the marginal social cost. In the terminology of economists, they would say they would want to force the business, which is currently producing an externality that's being paid, or producing a cost that's being paid by a third party. We would want to force the business to pay that cost and recognize that cost as part of its production process. So economists call that internalizing the externality. Okay, the government wants to find a way to internalize the externality, force one of the two participants in the trade to bear the cost that is currently being borne by third parties. Bless you. So in a perfect world, okay, what might happen here is the government might impose a tax. And in this case, a $1 tax. The value of the per unit value of the externality. For every unit of aluminum produced, the business pays $1 to the government. That's, of course, going to raise their cost of production per unit by $1, shifting the supply curve in from MPC to MSC, and then causing the business to produce at the socially optimal level of output and eliminating the deadweight loss, correcting the misallocation of resources in a perfect world. Right? Okay. So that's sort of rationale for government action. Of course, it assumes that the government can figure out what exactly the marginal social cost or what the extra social cost of producing aluminum is, what the externality is, that the government can then come in and pass a law in a timely way that imposes this $1 tax. And then once it does that, they can put together a bureaucracy which is able to actually enforce the law, right, and ensure that businesses aren't dodging that tax. And a lot of economists and other people would argue that governments aren't very good at doing any of those things, right? But nevertheless, okay, the model tells us that governments in a perfect world could do that, right? And even if they can't do it perfectly, okay, they can at least partially remedy the misallocation of resources. Okay, so that's a negative externality. On the AP exam, when you get an externality that's negative, it's, as far as I know, its effect is always on the supply side. Okay, so you should always represent it on the supply side. Now, if you're like friends with some kids who are taking IB classes, or if you go on the internet and you get onto some IB teacher's website, I got one. It's out there somewhere. I never use it anymore because I used to teach IB, but I never use it anymore. It's out there. It's still on the internet. Right? So you will see that negative externalities can sometimes be represented in consumption. Right? So, for example, everyone okay? Fall asleep?
No, I was trying.
Right, so, all right, so anyway, sometimes, like for example, smoking cigarettes. right? So you buy a package of cigarettes. I've never bought a package of cigarettes in my life. It's disgusting. But let's just say you do. They're like, say it's $2 for a package of cigarettes, right? So you pay $2 for a pack of cigarettes because you assume that you'll get about $2 worth of value, whatever you get from cigarettes. Your taste, your high, whatever you get, right? So, and you figure you get $2 worth of value, right? So you smoke it, right? And then you blow it in Hoffman's face, right? And Hoffman gets cancer, right? Right? And, right? Hope not. But that's what happens, right? It's called secondhand smoke, right? Here, I've paid the tobacco company $2, right? They've gotten their $2, I'm getting my $2 worth of value, and he's paying an external cost, right? That cost comes in consumption, doesn't it? It doesn't come in the production process like with aluminum and pollution. It comes in the consumption of the cigarette, right? And so economists sometimes would represent that as a demand curve of having the effect on the demand side, where the value, the actual value to society is actually less than $2, okay? But in AP economics, you shouldn't do that. I have never seen an AP exam where students are expected to do that. So you should just know that when you get a negative externality, the effect will be like you see here, okay? On the supply side with a marginal social cost curve, that's to the left of a marginal private cost curve, okay? Now some externalities are negative, but they're positive. Yeah, how about that?
It's the same dead weight. Same graph. Yes, I'm an idiot. This is why the people still not me.
Okay. Okay. So same thing. In AP economics, a positive externality will almost always be shown through on the demand side. Okay, but it's actually possible that you can have positive externalities of production too. Okay, but we're just going to talk about consumption externalities. Okay, so here we have the price of immunizations. What's an immunization?
Vaccine.
The vaccine, right? So I take the polio vaccine or the mumps vaccine, the measles vaccine, whatever it is, right? And when I consume that, I'm willing to pay some amount of money for that, right? So that's represented by this private demand, or this private benefit, okay? But then when I consume the immunization, I protect myself, and I'm willing to pay whatever the cost is, whatever the price is, in order to do that. But I also ensure that when I consume the immunization, when I get the immunization, that other people who would get sick, if I got sick because I hadn't taken the immunization, that they won't get sick. So they benefit because I consume the good, even if they don't consume the good. Right? So I buy the immunization from the pharmaceutical company or from the doctor who bought it from the pharmaceutical company. Right? I consume it, and I only pay for, I only value that because it protects me or my son and daughter. Right? I don't really care that everyone else is healthier as a result. I mean, it's a consequence of it. It's all nice and everything, right? But I'm not really willing to pay for that. Right? Nevertheless, it's an external benefit, right? So for every unit of output, for every immunization bought and consumed, there's a benefit to society that the consumer didn't consider, okay? And thus you get this difference between the social benefit of immunizations and the private benefit of immunizations, okay? So if the market is left to its own devices, the amount of immunizations produced and consumed at Q market there, okay, will be less than what would be the optimal amount of immunizations at Q optimum, where the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost are equal. Okay, so then you get this deadweight loss. Okay. So whereas with a negative externality, there's an overproduction of the good, an overallocation of resources to the production of the good, and the government seeks to reduce the amount of output. With a positive externality, there's an underproduction of the good, an underallocation of resources to the production of the good, and the government seeks to increase the amount of output, to incentivize more production and consumption. And so what it does is it subsidizes. Okay? Now, in some countries, what this looks like is essentially free immunizations. Okay? Of course, if immunizations were free, how much would be consumed? Well, you know exactly how many, right? At a zero price. That's the amount of output, right? Or that's the amount that consumers would want to consume, and that's what they would consume if the government subsidized it to zero. But typically, that's not what we're going to do. Okay, we're going to say that the government gives consumers a certain amount of money in order to go out and buy immunizations, maybe $20, maybe $10, some kind of a voucher or some kind of a tax break. Okay, in any case, it's a subsidy. Okay, that subsidy essentially makes it cheaper for consumers to consume the good and increases their demand so that the marginal social benefit and the marginal private benefit become the same, and the market produces and consumes at the optimum level of output. Okay? Done. It's a wrap.